And Amy, well, the tweet may have disrupted the narrative. At least members of the White House staff, other than the president, wanted on this day, with the House passing two important pieces of legislation related to cracking down on illegal immigration, Kate's Law, to impose stiffer penalties on persons here illegally who commit violent crimes, and then the strictures for sanctuary cities, well, for all cities, with respect to complying with federal law enforcement and the punishment in terms of funding if certain cities, most notably the couple hundred sanctuary cities around the country, don't comply. That was all lost because of Trump's tweet about JOICA, as I call them.
And we're not going to read the tweet again. I'm tweeted out.
Yes, exactly.
We all know what it said.
For more on what did happen yesterday in the House, moving over to the Senate, and what may happen in the Senate next week on Obamacare Replace, we're pleased to be joined again by our friend Mike Emanuel. He is the chief congressional correspondent and senior political correspondent for Fox News. Mike, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Dan and Amy, good morning. Great to be with you.
Good to be with you. And so why don't we start with healthcare, since that's been the topic that's dominated the week up until Trump's tweet about silly cable news shows. It seems the scuttlebutt, and we've talked to Grover Norquist and Ed Fulner yesterday, there seems to be a consensus among some that understand the Beltway dynamics pretty good that the conservatives are close to coming on board and that you're going to see the Senate bill move perhaps as early as next week. Is that your read?
You know, it's a fascinating time. It's a very difficult read at this point. Everybody says don't count Majority Leader Mitch McConnell out, that he's a master tactician in terms of figuring out how to thread the needle, in this case, basically between the moderates and the conservatives. I have heard the sense that the conservatives may come on board. They just want to get rid of some more of the Obamacare regulations. That seems to be a pretty easy fix. The wild card, though, is I talked to one of the moderate senators last night, and I said, well, what do you think about $45 billion being added to address the opioid problem in this country? And she said, well, that's a good start, but she said that doesn't get me to yes. And so I'm wondering whether the moderates are going to make a much bigger demand in terms of the Medicaid extension, when you wind that down. And so if they say it has to be, 7 years, does that lose some of the conservatives, or do the conservatives just, hold their noses and vote for it so they can move on to tax reform and other major priorities on the agenda?
Well, that lawmaker you spoke with, how much is enough? So is $45 billion not enough for opioid addiction treatment, or what exactly do they want? That's a great question. And we know that Ohio and West Virginia are two of the worst states in terms of drug overdoses. And so a lot of attention's been put on Rob Portman from Ohio, Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia. What's it going to take to get them on board? And so everybody seems happy that is in there in terms of trying to address this epidemic in a lot of our communities across the country. But then they're worried about the Medicaid expansion. And I know Governor Kasich in Ohio has been very outspoken about, or concerned about, how are they going to wind this down, and then what happens when you do wind it down. And so I reported yesterday that Rob Portman and Mitch McConnell got into it this week over the Medicaid expansion, which is highly unusual. Portman's a very mild-mannered person typically, and he's a very close ally of McConnell's. But apparently with, the drug treatment aspects, he's gotten very emotional about it and says, we're losing thousands of people in my state, and it's my job to figure out a way to get them treatment. And so he's fighting to the bitter end on that. So I would like to think that when they come back from the 4th of July recess, they may be able to figure a path. But it also does feel like that in a lot of these meetings that they restate their positions, and there hasn't been a ton of movement so far. So we'll see.
Yeah, but if they're just arguing about price, usually those things get worked out. It's not a principle at stake, so you're just arguing about funding level.
Fair point. Absolutely. And we'll see the votes. I also do get a sense, though, some of the Republicans, don't want to get there because they don't really want to own what comes next for the rest of their careers. We saw, obviously with Obamacare, a lot of Democrats lost their jobs over time because the American people weren't happy with the way it was
happening or, rolling out. And so I think there are some concerned about, if this system doesn't really work, we're going to own it for the rest of our careers. And maybe that's not the most courageous stand, but that may be a political reality with some here on Capitol Hill.
Starting from the premise that personnel is policy and the importance and complications of the communications coming from the White House, with the prominence of Sarah Huckabee Sanders and some of the reporting that suggests that Sean Spicer may be kind of kicked upstairs to a communications director role, but not be the face guy doing the press briefings anymore. When they come back from that recess next week, are we going to see a new face of the Trump administration to the D.C. press corps, Sarah Huckabee Sanders or someone else?
I've heard that they've been talking to folks about trying to find that right person to get out front and to be the face and voice of the Trump administration. I know they talked to my colleague Kimberly Guilfoyle at some point to see if she might have interest. I understand she just signed a long-term contract to stay with us, which is great news for us. So, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, after the Mika Brzezinski stuff, having a woman out there as an effective voice and face of the administration is certainly not a bad idea. It's a difficult job, when you've got a president who's a TV guy who hangs on every word of the briefing and then critiques you afterwards. It's very, very challenging. Obviously, it's a great opportunity for somebody in that line of work, but we'll see whether Huckabee Sanders is the person he wants out front or whether he's got somebody else in mind. They all serve at the pleasure of the president in these roles, and so if the president loves what you're doing, you're great, and if the president decides it's time for a change, I think they all understand that change could come quickly.
But is it your sense that change is going to come? We just don't know what form it's going to take, that Spicer is not going to be the front guy anymore?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Dan. There's been rumblings pretty much since the president took office that there was changes coming, and Reince Priebus has been able to hang in there as the chief of staff, and we've heard some frustration with the communication shop, and so I'm not surprised that Spicer will be moving on to a new role. But, it sounds like they value him, but they just don't like him as being the face and voice of the administration. So it sounds like he'll be sticking around. But, there's a lot of intrigue here on Capitol Hill about possible tweaks to the lineup, if you will, over at the White House and the impact that could have on the narrative across the country.
Well, President Trump, speaking of his tweeting, he was up early. Tweeting started at 5:46 this morning, but he also indicated in a tweet that he might concede the Senate health care plans. Well, he's conceding that it may fail. He said if Republican senators are unable to pass what they are working on now, they should immediately repeal and then replace at a later date. Is that a bit of a concession?
Yes, and perhaps a sign of frustration, which I know a lot of folks here on the Hill are feeling at this point. Rand Paul floated the idea the other day, the Kentucky senator, of splitting the bills so you would get, presumably all the Republicans to vote for a repeal, and then you could get Democrats to work with moderate Republicans on the spending aspects as a second bill. We'll see if that has legs to it. I know Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse is out this morning with a letter he's sending to the president basically saying we should do repeal. If we can't get a deal by July 10th, that they should do repeal immediately with a one-year delay to basically say it'll take effect 1 year from today, and then cancel the August recess, and then work tirelessly on what the replacement would look like, and giving yourself a year to do it. So, those are the ideas people are coming up with as Plan B in case they can't get Plan A done by July 10th.
All right. He is Mike Emanuel, chief congressional correspondent and senior political correspondent for Fox News. Mike, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Have a great weekend.
You too.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's like